On a summer evening in an American town in 1915, you might finish dinner, the sun's setting, and the house is getting warm, but you don't turn on a TV. There's no internet to scroll, and in many households, the backyard is still mainly a utilitarian zone for chickens, maybe the outhouse, the vegetable garden, and the laundry, not yet a dedicated leisure space. So you go to the front porch. When you sit there, you're stepping into a social ritual that shaped American life for generations. The front porch is not just a piece of wood nailed to a house, it's what scholars of space and architecture would call a liminal zone, a threshold between private home and public street. Sitting on the front porch sends a quiet signal to the neighborhood. I'm home, and I'm available. That posture creates a special kind of socialization, low stakes interaction. From the porch, you can chat with a neighbor for 30 seconds without inviting them in, wave to the mail carrier, or trade a few words with a couple next door. And these encounters don't require a calendar invite or cleaned up living room, right? They're almost frictionless, and they build a network of weak ties that connects people who aren't intimate friends but still recognize and care about one another. Over the 20th century, several powerful technologies and planning choices gradually eroded this porch-centered culture, especially after World War II. They didn't literally destroy it overnight, but together they made porch sitting less central to daily life and pushed everyday sociability inward and away from the street. The first major shift was the dominance of the automobile. In the early 1900s, streets in many towns were full of pedestrians, children playing, streetcars, and vendors. They were lively and worth watching from a porch. As cars took over, those same streets became louder, faster, and more dangerous, more like traffic corridors than public living rooms. The view from the front of the house became a stream of vehicles rather than a slow parade of neighbors, and the incentive to sit and watch weakened. The second shift was mass media, especially television. So before TV, much of the entertainment and news of daily life came from what happened outside and from conversation. So as television spread in the post-war decades, more evening attention moved indoors to the glowing box in the living room. People spent more time consuming packaged stories from distant studios and less time producing culture themselves through talk, music, and games in semi-public spaces like porches and stoops. The third shift was air conditioning. Before mechanical cooling became widespread, a hot July night could turn a house into an oven, and going outside was often the most comfortable option. As air conditioning spread in the mid-20th century, especially in warmer regions, households gained the ability to seal their windows and retreat into cool, quiet, enclosed living rooms. The porch stopped being a biological necessity and became an optional extra. At the same time, American architecture and suburban design were changing in ways that pulled that social life away from the front of the house. In many post-war developments, builders reduced or eliminated generous front porches and emphasized driveways, garages, setbacks, and private back spaces instead. So instead of deep, usable porches facing the street, many homes ended up with small stoops at the front and patios or back decks at the rear, often enclosed by tall fences. The front of the house became the interface with cars. The back became the place for guests and gatherings. So this architectural shift carries a big sociological implication. A front porch faces the shared street and implicitly invites casual contact with passersby. A back deck faces the interior of the lot and typically requires an invitation, so the people on it are screened off from the public realm. When the main social spaces of a neighborhood move behind fences and house walls, the default interaction with neighbors becomes more selective and deliberate. You now have to be invited into someone's life rather than just encountering them in the course of an evening. Zooming out to the scale of neighborhoods and cities, these changes intersected with zoning and land use rules. Large parts of post-war America were built under codes that separated housing from shops, offices, and cafes, enforced low densities, and prioritized automobile access through wide roads and abundant parking. In many suburbs, this means you can walk safely to a mailbox or around a cul-de-sac, but not to a corner bar, cafe, or plaza, because those third places are pushed miles away and wrapped in parking lots. The built environment makes spontaneous social encounters rare and turns seeing other people into a trip. We talked about this in one of my other videos just recently, and urban sociologists describe those informal gathering spots outside home and work as third places: the bar, the cafe, the public square, the community center, the playground. In many European cities and towns, older street grids, mixed-use zoning, and strong traditions of public life sustain plazas, main streets, and sidewalk cafes that still function as everyday living rooms for the community. Evening rituals like the Italian passeggiata or the Spanish paseo, where people stroll not to get somewhere, but to see and be seen, use the street itself as a kind of collective front porch, right? With everyone participating in a shared visible rhythm of life. In the United States, by contrast, the combination of car-centric design and single-use zoning has made those kinds of walkable, spontaneous third places relatively scarce in many suburbs. If you want to see people, you often have to get into a car and drive to a specific destination. A restaurant, a mall, a big box store, a gym. Socializing becomes scheduled, planned, and effortful instead of something that happens naturally, organically when you step outside and sit down. Time use surveys put numbers to this shift. On an average day, people in the U.S. now spend roughly half an hour, about 35 minutes, socializing and communicating in person, which adds up to only around 4 hours a week. Comparable analyses suggest that in several European countries, people spend substantially more time in face-to-face leisure with friends and family, in some cases closer to 7 to 9 hours weekly. The exact figures vary by study, but the pattern is consistent. American daily life includes relatively little unstructured in-person social time. This change doesn't just affect loneliness, it also touches trust and safety. Urbanist Jane Jacobs argued that safe, lively neighborhoods depend on eyes on the street, right? Residents, shopkeepers, and passersby casually watching what happens on sidewalks and in public spaces. Traditional walkable main streets with stoops, porches, and active ground floors naturally generate those eyes. When more of life takes place behind garages, windshields, and backyard fences, sidewalks and front yards can empty out, and it becomes harder to know who belongs in the neighborhood and who doesn't. International surveys of interpersonal trust highlight how deeply these patterns may matter. In some high-trust societies like Denmark, roughly 3/4 of respondents say most people can be trusted. In the United States, the share answering that way has dropped to around 1/3 of adults, depending on the year and survey. Researchers link these gaps to many forces: economic inequality, social policy, media ecosystems, political polarization, but the everyday experience of seeing or not seeing neighbors is one of the channels through which trust either grows or erodes. Porches, in other words, turned out to be tied into a lot more than evening relaxation. When front-facing semi-public spaces thin out, the effects ripple through other parts of social life. And politics becomes more abstracted and more mediated by screens because people have fewer casual face-to-face encounters across difference. Neighbors are more likely to meet as avatars in online conflicts than as familiar faces on the steps. Campaigns that once relied on walking blocks and talking on porches shift toward television ads and digital micro-targeting, which reach more voters but build less shared civic fabric. Parenting also changes. A front porch or stoop gives adults a position from which to talk with each other while children roam within a loose, visible territory. Kids can play in the street or on the sidewalk under the casual supervision of many households, which supports independence and teaches them to negotiate conflicts on their own. When streets become dominated by fast traffic and front porches empty out, play is pushed into backyards, organized activities, and indoor environments. Parents feel they must act as a constant chaperone, right? Fear rises even in periods where crime is actually falling. Safety and crime prevention shift from informal to formal systems. A street lined with occupied porches and stoops is full of natural observers, and their presence alone discourages some opportunistic misbehavior. When those observers vanish, communities often respond with more police patrols, more private security, and more cameras to reclaim a sense of safety. Those tools can deter crime, but they don't replace the subtle relational accountability that comes from being recognized, waved at, and quietly monitored by people who know your name. Even deeply personal domains like dating and courtship feel different without porch-like thresholds. Historically, in many communities, a front porch offered a semi-public setting for couples to talk, close enough to family oversight that everyone felt some reassurance, but open enough to give them relative privacy. As those liminal spaces shrank, early relationship time moved further into fully private interiors, cars, apartments, or into disembodied digital interactions on apps and chats. Relationships now start and evolve in spaces that are either highly private or completely disconnected from the neighborhood's gaze. Religious and civic life were affected in similar ways. In many towns, the line between the church or club and neighborhood used to be thin, and people walked to services or meetings, then lingered on sidewalks and porches, continuing conversations on the way home. When congregants and members drive in from scattered suburbs, park, attend, and drive away, those institutions become standalone events on a schedule rather than threads woven through street life. It's easier to drift away from a community that you only see at formally scheduled times, right? Porches also carry symbolic weight around class and aspiration. A deep shaded front porch historically signaled rootedness and a willingness to be seen as part of the local scene. As the architectural ideal shifted toward big private backyards, expansive decks, and sometimes gated entries, the image of the good life turned inward. Status became associated with how self sufficient and hidden your home could be, how much leisure and comfort you could enjoy out of public view. That reinforces a culture in which those with resources buy privacy and private amenities, while those without rely on whatever public spaces remain. Even daily work rhythms are different without a front facing decompression space. The porch once served as a buffer between the demands of the job and the intimacy of the kitchen table, a place to sit and process the day while watching neighbors come and go. As commutes lengthened and the default transition space became the driver's seat, that reflective time moved into traffic and parking lots. Remote work, for those who have it, could re-anchor people in their neighborhoods, but without welcoming front spaces or walkable streets, many remote workers still spend most of their time either indoors or in commercial third spaces like cafes. Cultural expression and local storytelling changed too. A porch is an easy stage for music, jokes, and neighborhood news, a place where someone can pick up a guitar or tell a story to whoever happens to pass. When those everyday stages are empty, culture skews even more toward curated venues and mass media. People still create art, but there are fewer low-pressure, hyper-local platforms where they can share it with the small audience of a block or a street corner. All of these threads come back to health, loneliness, and social capital. A society in which most people only encounter each other in cars, stores, and scheduled events will naturally feel more anonymous and brittle than one where people routinely see neighbors from their porches and steps, exchange a few words, and accumulate a dense mesh of weak ties. That mesh is the infrastructure of mutual aid, the rides to the doctor, the meals after surgery, the informal job leads, the "I saw your kid, they're okay." Its strength depends on small, unremarkable contacts that porches once made easy. Rebuilding all of suburban America is not an option, but some choices are still very much on the table. Cities and towns can adjust zoning to allow more mixed-use, walkable neighborhoods and to foster third places like plazas, cafes, small shops, and pocket parks. Designers and builders can give new homes usable front-facing spaces again, stoops, small porches, low walls, and shared front gardens, so there's somewhere comfortable to sit facing the world. Residents can reclaim whatever threshold they have, a few steps, a folding chair in the front yard, a bench under a tree, as a deliberate social space. The larger lesson is that the atomic self, the isolated, anxious individual, didn't just appear out of nowhere. It is, in part, an outcome of physical decisions. Which side of the house gets the social space? How far homes sit from the street? Whether daily errands can be done on foot? Whether there's anywhere outside your front door to simply be? The United States has spent decades investing in privacy, convenience, and car mobility, and in doing so, it has often paid with a thinner everyday trust and weaker community fabric. One modest act of resistance is as simple as opening the front door, stepping out onto whatever passes for a porch, and relearning the slow, quiet skill of being present in public, available for whatever small interactions might come. If you guys have any thoughts or ideas, drop something in the comments for me. Let me know. Look forward to hearing your comments. Take care. Bye.